Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you this week is a significant drop in the life expectancy of your average United States adult. Further, we have just what has happened to the no-patent vaccine that was meant to change the way the world was distributing a response to COVID-19. The way some crops are growing better in cities, which isn't how this is meant to work. An unusual reason as to why mosquitoes seem to find a human to draw blood from, and the idea of building a space-based solar collector in order to power the world. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. We'll start with life expectancy. If you were born before the turn of the century, you could expect to live somewhere above 80 years. If you were born sometime in the last 20 years or thereabouts, you could expect to have lost somewhere around 5 years of life. This is the biggest decrease in 100 years of the life expectancy for an American. This increase is not just caused by a change in life. Rather, it's a vast number of different factors that come into play. One of the more significant contributors is the increase in overdoses and accidents that have lowered the life expectancy. COVID-19 has played a role in this increase, but it hasn't accounted for all of it. And that's why, despite there being a loss of nearly a whole year of life from the average lifespan, only half of that is down to COVID, and half of it is due to other factors. Of course, these results are preliminary, but they do account for 99% of the data that's available, so we can take them with a fair amount of certainty. But when the final results are released in December, there may be slight changes to the exact figures. Next we'll go to the COVID-19 vaccine that was meant to change the world. It was supposed to have no limiting patents on it, thereby allowed for use just about everywhere at low cost. The vaccine was at least approved for use in India, but how far has it gone? At least in India, it's gone for 90 million doses. That's a pretty good distribution network by any standard. In many other countries, close to 100 million doses of any given vaccine would be considered a decent achievement and on par with most of those countries. While this was a late entrant into the vaccine marketplace, which already seemed quite saturated with many larger manufacturers producing and then selling their approved vaccines, it's found its niche, but not where everybody else has in the developed world. Rather, it's looking at countries that have low income and therefore can't afford to buy in the vaccine. Instead, they will need to rely on domestically produced vaccines. In this case, it is made with many of the cultural considerations for these countries in mind. It uses cheap ingredients, and it has no major limitations. This is why it's become popular, especially in Southeast Asia and Africa. In other COVID-19 related news, but this time something of a, let's say, depressing turn of events. Australian anti-vaxxers who sued the federal and state governments about the vaccine mandates and the impact on their lives have been told they will need to pay over $214,000 in costs after their case was dismissed. The matter that was put before the court didn't even go so far as to get a hearing, and understandably. They were arguing that the New World Order had been trying to make everybody bend to their whim, and therefore this was a breach of the Nuremberg Code. It almost looks like they went to the bingo board of conspiracy theories and threw darts at it until they had enough for their complaint to be lodged. There are 9 named applicants who were part of this suit, and all 9 are expected to contribute to paying this $214,000. That means they're all looking at paying somewhere around $25,000 in costs for their nonsense. It seems, at least in some part, that some of the people involved in this lawsuit can't separate social media from reality. They also can't understand that not all events are linked. that some things can occur around the same time and have no association. One example of this is that an equestrian rider who was 19 years old developed blood clots in their lungs, and they blame this entirely on the vaccines. At present, there is no confirmation other than the claims from the person involved that anything they've experienced is related to the vaccines. But despite that and the other people involved in this, they have all fundamentally been told that you now need to pay up for being absolutely silly. In other medical news, but going to ancient history rather than even older history with conspiracy theories, we've found genetic evidence of Kleinfelter Syndrome in a 1,000-year-old skeleton. The skeleton was taken from a site in Portugal, and after looking through the genomics of this person, they found a XXY chromosome set. This isn't necessarily a major find. The chances of there being incorrect chromosomal separation are pretty high, even today. Up to 1 in every 1,000 males are born this way. The study authors themselves do advise taking some caution with their findings. This primarily stems from the fact that DNA, especially this old DNA, is very prone towards degradation. That means you either need to find ways to fill in the gaps or isolate a very pure sample. They had to do the former rather than the latter. They used a model that was, in effect, able to fill in the gaps, and this means they could find out what the chromosomes present were and therefore figure out that there was an extra X chromosome. The reason you rely on genetics for this, rather than other possible methods that can be used in archaeology, is that most of the evidence that you would have from Kleinfelter Syndrome isn't going to show up as much in the way of a pathology. They might be somewhat taller, have broader hips, and less hair, but that's about all you can really say. From a pathological point of view, they might have an increased risk of diabetes and heart disease, but again, you're not really able to find anything in the remains themselves, especially skeletal remains. Cutting-edge research that is modern looks instead at how we can grow crops more effectively, or at least where we can grow them more effectively. There is a general argument to be made that large monocultures produce crops more effectively. You have a single, specific crop being grown in a large area. It requires the same treatment, it can be harvested at roughly the same time, and therefore you get better yields for less work. This is great if you have the land available for that. This is why if you go driving through a large agricultural area, you will find fields upon fields of the same produce being made. What researchers have found now is that that might work for something like, say, wheat, barley, rye, rice and other grains or other large field-type foods, but not necessarily for things like cucumbers, potatoes and lettuce. They found that yields of these and others can be up to 4 times higher when grown in an urban environment rather than rural or farming areas. Since the Industrial Revolution, we have seen far more people living in cities rather than in the wider countryside. This is a pattern that's being replicated right across the world, where countries who are developing their own large cities are seeing the same phenomena, people moving from the country to the town in order to get jobs and training. This means that we have fewer people who are growing food and have to figure out if we can survive by bringing more of it into the city itself. The researchers say that between 15 and 20% of food is grown within a city limit, and 5 to 10% of these are legumes, vegetables, and tubers. This means that a city trying to grow what it isn't ideally suited for would be putting a lot of time, effort, and resources into something where it's not efficient. But conversely, like we mentioned with large monocultures, if you can get more out of less space within a city, it doesn't make sense to have to grow it somewhere far away from the town and then ship it in. While the researchers did not find any particular spaces that were better overall for growing crops, they did find that some crops were more suited to some locations. For example, something like tomatoes would work well in hydroponic environments, But things like lettuces, kale, and broccoli, not so much, but they did fit into a vertical garden. They did also state the somewhat obvious that you can't grow apples stacked 5 or 10 layers high in a growth chamber. After all, your standard apple tree is not exactly suited to that. They also mentioned that there was limited evidence that you could grow something like wheat vertically. The changing times are going to have to eventually fit into what we can and can't do, and technology is playing a big role in that, and it may, in some ways, help with growing large amounts of vegetables and fruit within cities themselves, thereby leaving the countryside to produce less space-efficient crops. Where technology may not be helping us is with blue light. Blue light is one of those things that if you work around technology quite a bit, you may have at some point or other been gifted glasses that are meant to filter it out, or you may be using a blue light filter on your phone, computer, or tablet. Blue light is one of those things that affects the brain in an interesting way. It can, in some ways, stimulate our brain, and it turns out it can, to a certain extent, stimulate the brains of Drosophila melanogaster, or your fruit fly. Using a filter to remove blue light is meant to help with your sleep. It's on a similar level of evidence as the use of melatonin. So we have some evidence that it's useful and relevant. An area that hasn't really been touched on so far is that this same blue light may be causing damage to cells in a broader sense. Of course, this research is in fruit flies, so take what we say with a significant amount of salt. What they did was take their fruit flies and expose them to this light for between 10 and 14 hours. They then compared these to fruit flies that were kept in darkness. The findings were that metabolites were generated and that these indicated cellular damage. This cellular damage was more so than what the flies kept in darkness were exhibiting. They argue that this is a sign of faster cellular aging and stress response. The two notable indicators they were looking at were succinate, which is involved in the production and growth of cells, which increased, and glutamate, which decreased and is one of the major neurotransmitters or ways cells communicate. These changes may also be just as pronounced as they are because the study has used an artificially inflated amount of blue light, significantly more than a human would be exposed to on an average day. This means that to get the same sort of response in humans, you would have to expose them to intensities of light that are very unusual. Going from flies to mosquitoes, and why mosquitoes can track down humans to feed on us. The primary mechanism they seem to rely on is our production of CO2. The reality is that in order to live, we need to break down energy sources, combine that with oxygen, and therefore make CO2 and get the desired ATP out of it. It would appear that mosquitoes have receptors in their antennae that are specifically made to detect these and sweat. By having both of them, they can identify where we are and then proceed to feed on us. It would appear that at least in one species of mosquitoes, this mechanism exists, but when you turn it off, it does not prevent them from detecting and then tracking down a human to feed on. The neurosystem involved in their sense of smell appears to have a good deal more flexibility than in other species. In fact, what it does is that it has somehow managed to connect multiple receptors for different scents to a single neuron. This is not what is supposed to happen. It's meant to be that one neuron is for one receptor, and therefore, if you disable that receptor, you should disable that neuron's ability to receive signals. What happens in this species of mosquito is that they have at least twice as many receptors, and as a result, you have not only twice the expression, but it would appear an ability to have a sort of redundancy built in, thereby preventing the mosquito from losing its ability to smell. As the researchers note, understanding how mosquitoes identify humans and then track them down allows for the better development of a mosquito repellent or blocker. Admittedly, the way they do this is by genetic modification to figure out which genes to turn on and turn off in order to get maximum results, simply by directly interfering with the ability to sense the smell of its target, something you would otherwise have to block with those repellents. Something else we can do with genetic modification is to recreate evolution in a much shorter time frame than is necessary. As was done in one recent study, you can take the millions, if not more years of time to evolve into a particular form and reduce it down to a year or less. The researchers used unfertilized embryonic stem cells, that is either an oocyte or a sperm cell. They were then able to imprint these, that is, mark them as either being inactive for gene expression or inactive for gene expression by something like methylation. This means that you can decide which genes, when the ovum or sperm are fertilized to create an embryo, are actually going to be working. You can effectively choose which version of a gene will be working and thereby favoring it, and if it's a better gene than the alternative, allowing for more of the progeny to survive, thereby passing on that gene to more individuals. This study was more specifically looking at if you can combine multiple chromosomes. In humans, this does happen, and it's nearly always adverse. But throughout time and evolution, humans have had some of our chromosomes either lost or merged. In this case, using mice, they were able to take chromosomes 4 and 5 and 1 and 2, some of the bigger chromosomes amongst mice. The fusion of 4 and 5 was the most successful, and although breeding was slower, the mice offspring were made. The fusion of chromosomes 1 and 2 in one set had no offspring whatsoever, while the other had larger mice, although slower, and unfortunately more anxious. The researchers believe that the reduction in the speed of reproduction owes to how the chromosomes aren't separating out normally, and therefore there are issues to do with how many cells can be made, and whether or not those cells that do divide can continue to do so effectively. Going from evolution of animals to evolution of technology, and the next proposed step for solar power. The idea is to deploy a system in space to collect solar energy and then send that back to Earth. The European Space Agency is considering a proposal which would put a power plant effectively into space that would rely on solar power. The solar energy industry is growing fairly quickly, and it is one of the preferred ways of generating power, at least on Earth. The problem with it being on Earth is that, amongst other things, you need to consider the weather, location of the installation, and of course, every 24 hours you have roughly 12 hours of darkness where you aren't generating any electricity. In space, you don't have this problem. The article from the NES goes through a number of the issues with this whole plan. The first that they point out is that it needs to go into stationary orbit, and this means that you need to send it up there with a heavy rocket. Those heavy rockets are very expensive and very difficult. The fact that the European Space Agency wants to cover a third of their current energy usage with these sorts of setups means that you're going to require, as they put it, dozens of the installations with 10 times the mass of the International Space Station. They estimate this would require thousands of heavy lift launches. The second issue they point out is you would have to crew them with humans. Even if you are using some self-assembly and robots, you still need some humans available for things that the robots and self-assembly simply can't figure out. Finally, there is the cost. The power generated from this is, according to their numbers, going to cost 3 times as much as energy produced from ground-based systems. You also need to include in that the fact you have to install some sort of receiver. In this case, they expect they're going to use a microwave receiver. That's going to allow them to take the energy generated from these panels in space, turn them into microwaves, which can then be converted back into electricity. Despite all this, the European Space Agency is intending on conducting their feasibility study to see whether or not there is a reason to do this, and just how economical it will be were they to go forward. The final piece of news we have for you this week regards the discovery of a planet in space that could be covered in water. They've effectively found Caladan from June. The planet is about 100 light years from Earth, and they expect it's covered in water. It's one giant ocean. The question is, why do they think that, and is it possible? This is based on observations from the James Webb Telescope, and so we are going to be getting more detail than we have previously. They believe it's a planet covered in water for several reasons. The first is that their modelling of it would indicate that it only has a modest amount of irradiation. This supports the initial supposition that it is a water world. Following that, it's the fact that it is on a very short orbit of its stars, just 11 days. Despite that, it is nearly 1.7 times the size of Earth. When you combine its location and size, it should be extremely hot. But fortunately, the star it's orbiting is very cool and dim compared to our Sun, and so this means that it's actually in the middle of a good zone. Not so hot that the water boils off, nor so cold that it freezes solid. With this information and a few other details, they were able to begin to figure out just what the mass of the planet was, and they think it's a little over 4.8 times that of Earth. When they take this information and its size, they can figure out that it's about 5.6 grams per cubic centimeter. Earth's density is about 5.5 grams per cubic centimeter, so the densities are very similar. The catch here is that because theirs is a much larger planet with more mass, it has to be made from a lighter material for that to work out. They believe that lighter material could be water, and it can make up 30% of the mass of the planet. Those kinds of numbers are closer to what we'd see with Europa, one of the moons that orbits Jupiter. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.